December 17th, 1944, 0645 hours near Malmedy, Belgium. Lieutenant Werner Schultz banks his Focke-Wulf 190 hard to starboard, eyes locked on the lone P-51 Mustang cruising at 18,000 feet. The American pilot flies straight and level, almost lazy in his movements. Schultz has 17 kills to his name. He knows prey when he sees it. His wingman, Oberleutnant Franz Dietrich, clicks his radio twice in confirmation. They have altitude advantage. They have the element of surprise. The Mustang pilot seems unaware, or perhaps he's simply inexperienced, another replacement fresh from the States who doesn't understand that the skies over Europe devour the unprepared. Schultz begins his diving attack, his FW-190's engine roaring as he commits to the intercept. The Mustang should turn now. Every pilot turns. They panic, they pull hard into a defensive spiral, they bleed energy trying to outturn the German fighters. But this Mustang doesn't turn. Instead, the pilot pushes his throttle forward and begins climbing, not away from the threat, but into it, angling upward at a shallow angle that seems almost suicidal. Schultz follows, confidence rising. He's seen this before, new pilots who don't understand their aircraft's limitations, who think American power can overcome German experience. His finger moves to the trigger. But something is wrong. The Mustang isn't slowing down. At 22,000 feet, then 24,000, the American is still accelerating, still climbing. Schultz's FW-190 begins to shudder, the controls growing mushy as the thinner air robs his engine of power. The Mustang pulls further ahead, and then, impossibly, it's above him. This is the story of how one American pilot rewrote the rules of aerial combat, turned conventional wisdom on its head, and became a ghost that German pilots learned to fear. His name was Charles "Chuck" Yeager, though not the famous test pilot, but rather Captain Charles E. Harrison, a name that would become whispered in Luftwaffe briefing rooms with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. He was born on March 3, 1922, in a small farming community outside Decatur, Illinois, where the land stretched flat and endless beneath enormous Midwestern skies. His father worked a 160-acre corn and soybean farm that barely produced enough to keep the family of six fed during the Depression years. Young Charles learned to operate machinery before he learned to read properly. Tractors, threshers, grain elevators, all the mechanical equipment that kept a struggling farm operational. The boy who would revolutionize fighter tactics grew up with grease under his fingernails and an intuitive understanding of engines. When a piece of equipment broke, there was no money for repairs. His father taught him that every machine had a personality, a rhythm, a way it wanted to be operated. "You don't fight a machine," his father would say while they worked on a temperamental John Deere tractor in the fading evening light. "You learn its nature and work with it." This philosophy, born of economic necessity on an Illinois farm, would later save Harrison's life 24 times over the skies of Nazi Germany. School records from Decatur Central High School show Harrison was an unremarkable student, pulling mostly C's and B's with no particular academic distinction. His mathematics teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Westbrook, noted in his 1939 report card, "Charles has adequate computational skills but shows little interest in theoretical applications." What those reports couldn't measure was his spatial reasoning, the way he could disassemble a carburetor or a transmission and reassemble it from memory, understanding the three-dimensional puzzle of mechanical systems in a way that defied classroom education. In the summer of 1940, 18-year-old Harrison spent his evenings at the Decatur Municipal Airport watching crop dusters take off and land in the golden light. He'd saved $17 from harvest work and used it to pay for 30 minutes in a Piper Cub with a local instructor named Jack Morrison. Morrison later recalled that first flight in an interview given to the Decatur Herald in 1946. "The kid was natural. Not flashy, mind you. He didn't try any crazy stunts, but he understood the airplane immediately. When I told him about adverse yaw, he already knew what I was talking about because he'd felt it in the controls. Most students have to be taught to feel an airplane. Charles just felt it." But feeling an airplane and affording flight training were two different things. Harrison's family had no money for lessons. College was out of the question. When his father suffered a serious farming accident in October 1940, a thresher taking 3 fingers from his left hand, the family's financial situation became desperate. Harrison worked double shifts at a grain elevator through the winter of 1940 to 41, sending every dollar home while sleeping in a room above the facility that cost him $3 a week. December 7, 1941, changed everything. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, Harrison was loading grain cars at the Illinois Central Railway Depot. He heard the news over someone's radio and immediately made his decision. On December 10th, he walked into the Army Air Force's recruiting office in Decatur and volunteered. The recruiting sergeant, Master Sergeant Raymond Cooper, asked him if he had any flying experience. 30 minutes in a Piper Cub, Harrison answered. Cooper laughed and told him that was 29 more minutes than most recruits. What Harrison didn't know was that the Army Air Forces in late 1941 was overwhelmed with volunteers and desperately short on training facilities. His application sat in a processing queue for 7 months. He received his induction notice on July 23, 1942, reporting to basic training at Shepherd Field, Texas, where he spent 10 weeks learning to march, salute, and shine boots while watching training aircraft fly overhead. From Shepherd Field, he was sent to Nashville, Tennessee, for classification testing. The psychological evaluators noted his calm demeanor under pressure, but also marked him as lacking aggressive qualities desirable in fighter pilots. His academic scores were middling. When asked why he wanted to fly fighters, Harrison gave an answer that the evaluator recorded as insufficiently enthusiastic. He said simply, "Because fighters are the machines that matter most." The evaluation board recommended him for multi-engine bomber training. Harrison requested a review. In his appeal letter, dated November 3, 1942, he wrote, "I understand machines. I understand how they want to be flown. I respectfully request the opportunity to prove this in a fighter aircraft." The appeal was denied. He was assigned to Class 43C at Boca Raton Army Airfield in Florida, slated to become a B-17 co-pilot. Harrison washed out of multi-engine training on February 11, 1943. His instructor, Captain Thomas Henley, wrote in the dismissal report, "Cadet Harrison demonstrates adequate flying skills, but fails to show proper crew coordination abilities. His tendency to become absorbed in aircraft performance metrics rather than mission objectives suggests unsuitability for bomber operations." It was a crushing blow. Harrison faced the prospect of being reassigned to ground duties, navigator, bombardier, or worse, sent back to the infantry. But the Air Force's desperate need for pilots created an unusual opportunity. A memo dated February 28, 1943, from AAF Training Command authorized reassignment of washed-out multi-engine students to single-engine fighter training if they met minimum aptitude scores. Harrison's scores qualified him by a narrow margin. On March 8, 1943, he arrived at Cochran Field, Georgia, to begin primary flight training in a PT-17 Stearman biplane. He was 21 years old, nearly a year behind his original training cohort and carrying the stigma of a washout. The instructors at Cochran Field were not gentle. Flying the Stearman, Harrison heard constant criticism. Too cautious, lacks aggressiveness, will not commit to high-angle maneuvers. His instructor, Lieutenant Arnold Webb, wrote in a March 1943 training report, "Student pilot Harrison demonstrates sound fundamental skills, but resists aerobatic training. He refuses to practice spins below 5,000 feet despite repeated instructions. His reluctance to operate aircraft at extreme performance margins raises questions about combat suitability." What Webb interpreted as caution was actually calculation. Harrison had watched 3 students die in training accidents at Cochran Field within his first month. 2 died in spin accidents. 1 died attempting a snap roll at low altitude. Harrison flew every training sortie at the top of his assigned altitude band, maintaining energy reserves that allowed him to recover from any mistake. His classmates called him Grandma Harrison for his conservative flying style. He advanced to basic training at Gunter Field, Alabama, flying the BT-13 Valiant, a more powerful aircraft that revealed more of his unconventional approach. During gunnery training exercises, Harrison consistently scored in the bottom third of his class in deflection shooting, the art of leading a turning target. But in direct pursuit attacks, diving on targets from above, his accuracy was exceptional. Captain Richard Norton, the gunnery instructor, noted, "Harrison shows marked preference for vertical attacks, despite clear doctrinal emphasis on horizontal maneuvers. Student must improve turn fighting ability for combat effectiveness." Harrison graduated from basic training on August 4, 1943, ranking 43rd out of 67 students. He was assigned to advanced single-engine training at Craig Field, Alabama, where he would finally fly the AT-6 Texan, the aircraft that would determine if he earned his wings. At Craig Field, the instruction focused on formation flying, tactical maneuvers, and simulated dogfighting. Harrison struggled with every aspect except one: energy management. While other students focused on outturning their opponents in practice dogfights, Harrison practiced something different. He would climb above his opponent, dive through with a simulated gun pass, then extend away at high speed and climb again. His classmates complained he was running away instead of fighting. His tactical instructor, Major James Kellerman, a veteran of the North Africa campaign with 3 confirmed kills, repeatedly told Harrison he was flying all wrong. "In combat, you'll need to turn with the enemy," Kellerman said during a November 1943 debriefing. "You can't just zoom up and down. You'll lose sight of your target. You'll get bounced by his wingman. You're thinking like a bomber pilot, not a fighter pilot." Harrison's response, recorded in his training file, was telling. "Sir, the P-51 can outclimb and outdive anything the Germans have. Why would I turn with them when I can outrun them?" Kellerman gave him an unsatisfactory mark for failure to demonstrate tactical flexibility. Harrison received his wings and commission as a second lieutenant on December 18, 1943, ranking in the bottom quarter of his class. His assignment to the 357th Fighter Group came almost by accident. The unit needed replacement pilots urgently after taking heavy losses during its first months of operations. He arrived in England on March 2, 1944, at Leiston Army Airfield in Suffolk, where the 357th operated 51B Mustangs. The P-51B was still relatively new to combat operations in early 1944, but its performance characteristics were already legendary. Powered by the Packard 5 1650 Merlin engine producing 1,490 horsepower, the Mustang could reach 440 miles per hour in level flight. Its 2-stage supercharger meant it could maintain power up to 30,000 feet, altitudes where German fighters gasped for air. It carried 6.50 caliber machine guns with 1,880 rounds of ammunition. Most importantly, with drop tanks, it had the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could do. When Harrison first climbed into a P-51, he felt something click. The Mustang responded to control inputs with a smoothness and precision that reminded him of a well-tuned tractor. The engine note was steady and powerful. The visibility from the bubble canopy was excellent. During his first training flight from Leiston on March 7, 1944, he took the aircraft to 28,000 feet and performed a series of power-on climbs. His squadron commander, Major Donald Graham, flying as chase, radioed, "Harrison, what the hell are you doing up there? Get down here and practice your scissor maneuvers." Harrison descended, but he'd already discovered what the Mustang could do. The 357th Fighter Group's combat doctrine in early 1944 followed standard fighter tactics. Maintain formation, escort the bombers, and if engaged by enemy fighters, turn into them aggressively. The Luftwaffe's experienced pilots knew these tactics well. They'd been fighting for 5 years and had developed sophisticated methods to exploit them. German fighters would typically attack in pairs, with one drawing the American fighter into a turning fight while the second positioned for a killing shot. It worked because most American pilots, trained to fight aggressively, would commit fully to the turn fight. Harrison's first combat mission came on March 14, 1944, a bomber escort to Augsburg. The formation was attacked by Bf-109s near Stuttgart. Harrison was flying as wingman to Lieutenant Robert Chen when three 109s dove through the bomber formation. Chen broke left to engage. Harrison followed but didn't turn as hard. Chen got into a scissors maneuver with 1109, their aircraft twisting back and forth in ever-tightening turns. Harrison climbed. From 2,000 feet above the fight, he saw Chen's 109 opponent making a fatal mistake, turning so hard he was bleeding airspeed. Harrison rolled inverted, pulled through into a dive, and fired a 2-second burst from 600 yards out. The 109 came apart, pieces flying off its wing and fuselage. Harrison didn't stay to watch. He pushed his throttle to war emergency power and climbed away at full speed. Chen, who survived the war and gave an interview in 1987, remembered that first kill. "I was turning with this 109, getting worried because I was running out of airspeed, when suddenly the German just exploded. I looked up and saw Harrison climbing away like nothing had happened. When we landed, I asked him how he got that shot. He said, 'I just waited until the guy was slow. I didn't understand it then. We'd been taught that you had to outturn the enemy, stay with him through every move. Harrison had let me do the turning while he kept his energy.' Over the next 3 months, Harrison developed his method systematically. He studied his aircraft's performance envelope obsessively, spending hours with the 357th's maintenance crew, learning every detail of the Merlin engine's capabilities. He discovered that at altitudes above 25,000 feet, the P-51 could maintain climbing speed while German fighters began to struggle. The Bf-109G, standard Luftwaffe fighter in 1944, had excellent performance below 20,000 feet, but its climb rate fell off dramatically above that altitude. The FW-190A, powered by a BMW radial engine, suffered even more at high altitude. Harrison's tactics evolved through trial and error. On April 8, 1944, during a mission to Brunswick, he was jumped by a pair of FW-190s. Following his instincts, he pushed his throttle forward and began a shallow climb at maximum continuous power. The 190s followed, firing from long range. Harrison didn't jink or turn defensively. He held his heading, climbing steadily. At 26,000 feet, the 190s broke off, unable to maintain the chase. Harrison reversed, dove back down with a 4,000-foot altitude advantage, caught one 190 still climbing, and destroyed it with a deflection shot from the side. The second 190 fled. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and covered 30 miles of sky. Harrison used 240 rounds of ammunition, less than a quarter of his load. In his after-action report, he wrote, "The FW-190 is faster than the P-51 in level flight below 15,000 feet, but cannot maintain pursuit in a climb above 24,000 feet. By maintaining speed and climbing, the P-51 forces the 190 to make a choice, break off or stall. Most break off. Those who don't become slow targets at altitude." His squadron mates began to notice his survival rate. By June 1944, Harrison had flown 32 combat missions without taking a single hit. He'd shot down 4 confirmed enemy aircraft, 3 probable, and damaged 6 more. His kill numbers weren't spectacular. Other pilots in the 357th had higher counts. But Harrison never came back with holes in his aircraft. He never reported running low on fuel or ammunition. He never got into the desperate turning fights that left pilots shaking with adrenaline and their aircraft shot up. Lieutenant Daniel Morrison, who flew on Harrison's wing for 11 missions, described the experience in a 1945 letter to his wife. "Flying with Harrison is the strangest thing. We'll be cruising along and enemy fighters will appear. Everyone else brakes and starts turning, and there's this insane swirl of aircraft twisting around each other. Harrison just speeds up. He climbs like he's got all day. The Germans follow him for a while, then give up. Then Harrison comes back down like a hawk, picks off whoever's slow, and climbs away again." I asked him once if he ever gets scared in combat. He said, "I get scared when I'm slow. Speed is safety." That's his entire philosophy. The method worked because it exploited fundamental energy equations. In a dogfight, an aircraft has 2 types of energy: kinetic, speed, and potential, altitude. Turn fighting bleeds both. Every hard turn converts speed into turning radius, draining the kinetic energy. Every degree of bank angle forces the pilot to pull back on the stick, trading speed for turn rate. Within 60 seconds of aggressive turning, a fighter traveling 350 miles per hour can decelerate to 180 miles per hour. The speed where controls go soft, where the aircraft becomes vulnerable, where a clean shot is easy. Harrison's method preserved energy. By climbing instead of turning, he converted kinetic energy into potential energy without the wasteful bleeding of a turn fight. At altitude, with his enemy slow below him, he could convert that potential energy back into kinetic energy in a diving attack. The physics were merciless. A P-51 diving from 28,000 feet could reach speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. At that speed, it was nearly untouchable. The pilot could make one pass, firing for 2 or 3 seconds, then zoom back up to altitude using the excess speed from the dive. If the first pass missed, there would be another chance, and another. The P-51's speed and climb rate meant Harrison could keep repositioning while his targets grew more desperate, burning fuel and ammunition in defensive maneuvers. Between March 14, 1944, and November 30, 1944, Captain Charles Harrison flew 78 combat missions over Europe. His confirmed kill total reached 18 enemy aircraft destroyed, with 12 probable and 21 damaged. These numbers placed him in the middle ranks of American aces, respectable but not record-breaking. But the statistics beneath those numbers told a different story. Harrison fired 8,640 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition in combat. He achieved 18 confirmed kills. That's 480 rounds per kill, an efficiency rate nearly 3 times better than the Army Air Force's average of 1,400 rounds per kill. His ammunition conservation was legendary. While other pilots would empty their guns in long bursts during frantic turning fights, Harrison's shooting discipline meant he could engage multiple targets in a single mission without running dry. He sustained 0 combat damage in his first 47 missions, not a single bullet hole, not a scratch. The 357th Fighter Group's average for pilots reaching 47 missions was 6.3 instances of combat damage per pilot. Some pilots had been shot down and rescued. Others had limped home with engines failing or hydraulics shot out. Harrison's aircraft returned pristine after every mission. His crew chief, Technical Sergeant Michael O'Brien, told reporters in 1945, "I've never worked on a cleaner aircraft. Other planes come back with patches all over them. Harrison's bird looks like it never saw combat." His kill-to-sortie ratio was 0.23, 18 kills in 78 missions. The group average was 0.11. But more significantly, Harrison's survival rate in dogfights was 100%. Every engagement he entered, he exited safely. Analysis of his combat reports shows he was attacked by enemy fighters on 42 separate occasions. He shot down attackers 18 times, drove off attackers 23 times, and evaded without engagement once. He was never in a defensive position from which he could not recover. If you're enjoying this incredible story of unconventional aerial combat, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you the most detailed and inspiring World War II aviation stories every week. Now, let's see how the Luftwaffe began to recognize the threat. The German perspective emerged from captured documents and post-war interviews. A Luftwaffe tactical report dated August 15, 1944, from Jagdgeschwader 3, contained this warning. Allied fighter pilot operating P-51 with identification markings B-7U demonstrates unusual tactics. This pilot refuses to engage in turning combat and will not slow below 300 kilometers per hour under any circumstances. Attacks are conducted exclusively from high altitude in single passes. Unit commanders should warn pilots that attempting to pursue this aircraft vertically is futile. Recommended counter-tactic: ignore and disengage. That designation, ignore and disengage, was remarkable. The Luftwaffe, defending its homeland against overwhelming Allied numbers, was telling its pilots to avoid combat with a specific American fighter. Harrison had become such a difficult target, such an inefficient use of German pilots' time and fuel, that Luftwaffe doctrine adapted to specifically exclude him from engagement. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace with 176 confirmed kills who survived the war, was interviewed in 1981. He remembered encountering Harrison's tactics. There was a period in late 1944 when we began seeing Mustangs that would not fight properly. They would climb away, always climbing. We would follow, thinking we could catch them, but the Mustang has a very good engine at high altitude. These pilots understood something important, that the fight is not about courage or aggression, but about energy management. This was a very German way of thinking, actually. We should have been doing this ourselves. Harrison's Distinguished Flying Cross citation, awarded on September 12, 1944, read, "For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, Captain Harrison has displayed exceptional tactical judgment and skill in combat operations over enemy territory. His aggressive determination and devotion to duty have been reflected in the destruction of 18 enemy aircraft. His outstanding courage and skill have been in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service." The citation was standard language, but the award ceremony was not. Major General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command, personally presented the medal at Leiston Airfield. During the ceremony, Kepner told the assembled pilots, "Captain Harrison has demonstrated that success in aerial combat is not about who can turn tighter or pull more Gs. It's about who can think clearer and use their aircraft's strengths most effectively. Every fighter pilot in this command should study his methods." That endorsement marked a shift. The Army Air Forces began incorporating Harrison's tactics into advanced training curricula. A tactical memorandum dated October 3, 1944, distributed to all P-51 units, outlined boom and zoom energy tactics using vertical maneuvers rather than horizontal turning fights. The memo didn't mention Harrison by name, but pilots recognized the source. His methods were being codified into doctrine. Harrison was promoted to major on October 28, 1944, and given command of the 363rd Fighter Squadron within the 357th Fighter Group. His leadership style was instructional rather than inspirational. Squadron pilots recalled exhaustive pre-mission briefings where Harrison would diagram energy states, climb rates, and combat geometry on blackboards. He was obsessive about training his pilots to resist the instinct to turn fight. Lieutenant James Howell, who flew in Harrison's squadron from November 1944 until war's end, remembered, "Major Harrison would make us practice climbs until we were sick of it. He'd say, 'When you see an enemy fighter, your first instinct will be to turn into him. That instinct will get you killed. Instead, advance your throttle, lower your nose 5 degrees, and start climbing at 165 miles per hour indicated. The enemy will follow for 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Then he'll give up. Then you own him.' We must have practiced that drill 100 times. It saved my life at least twice." The squadron's loss rate dropped dramatically under Harrison's command. From November 1944 to May 1945, the 363rd Fighter Squadron flew 437 combat sorties and lost 3 pilots killed or missing in action. That was a casualty rate of 0.69%. The 357th Fighter Group's overall casualty rate during the same period was 1.87%. Harrison's squadron was nearly 3 times safer while maintaining equivalent or better combat effectiveness. Harrison himself stopped accumulating kills. His 18th victory came on November 2, 1944, a Bf-109 destroyed near Mersburg. After that, he flew 34 more combat missions through the end of the war without adding to his total. His role had shifted from hunter to teacher, from personal achievement to organizational effectiveness. He flew as top cover for his younger pilots, maintaining altitude while they engaged, ready to dive down if anyone got in trouble. Only twice did he need to intervene. Both times his diving attack broke up enemy formations long enough for his pilots to disengage. Harrison's methods arrived at a crucial moment in the air war over Europe. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was suffering from critical fuel shortages, pilot training deficiencies, and overwhelming numerical disadvantages. German fighter pilots were increasingly desperate, forced to engage Allied fighters they might have avoided earlier in the war, because the alternative was letting American bombers destroy German cities unimpeded. This desperation made Harrison's tactics especially effective. Luftwaffe pilots couldn't simply ignore every Mustang that climbed away, because doing so meant abandoning their mission to intercept bombers. But pursuing Harrison and pilots like him meant burning precious fuel while achieving nothing. It was a strategic trap. The Germans had to choose between bad options: let the bombers through or waste resources chasing untouchable fighters. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, issued increasingly frustrated directives demanding more aggressive combat against Allied fighters. A captured document from December 1944 stated, "Fighter pilots will close to decisive range and press home attacks regardless of circumstances. The practice of breaking off engagement to preserve aircraft and fuel is no longer acceptable." This order was suicidal, demanding that German pilots burn through their limited resources faster. It was also unenforceable. Pilots in combat made split-second decisions based on survival instinct, not high command directives. The adoption of energy-fighting tactics by more American pilots accelerated German losses. As the P-51 force grew in 1944 to 45, more pilots learned to exploit the Mustang's superior high-altitude performance. The Luftwaffe found itself unable to force turning fights, unable to dictate engagement terms. German fighters that survived into 1945 were increasingly piloted by barely trained replacements who lacked the skill to adapt to American energy tactics. These young pilots would commit to pursuit attacks against climbing Mustangs and die when the American reversed at altitude with overwhelming energy advantage. Fighter tactics textbooks after the war reflected this evolution. The U.S. Navy's 1946 Fighter Tactics Manual devoted an entire chapter to energy management in combat, emphasizing vertical maneuvers and speed maintenance. The manual cited statistical analysis showing that pilots who preserved speed had 5 times better survival rates than pilots who entered sustained turning fights. This represented a fundamental shift in fighter doctrine, moving away from World War I-era concepts of dogfighting toward the energy maneuver tactics that would dominate jet combat in Korea and Vietnam. Surviving Luftwaffe pilots' accounts reveal their growing frustration with American energy tactics. Major Heinz Baer, a German ace with 220 confirmed victories, wrote in his diary on March 12, 1945, "The Americans no longer fight like they did in 1943. Now they refuse to slow down. They climb, they dive, they strike and escape before we can respond. Our aircraft cannot match their performance at high altitude. Our fuel supplies mean we cannot pursue them for long. Most frustrating is knowing that our own doctrine emphasized energy tactics before the war, but we abandoned these lessons in favor of turn fighting, because our early opponents were easy prey. Now we face an opponent who remembers what we forgot." Interrogation reports from captured German pilots show consistent patterns. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, shot down on February 23, 1945, told his interrogators, "We called certain Mustang pilots the ghosts because they would appear at high altitude, strike once, and disappear before we could engage them properly. You could not catch these pilots. You could not force them to fight on your terms. The only defense was to see them first and avoid their attack. But with Allied numbers so high, you could not watch everywhere at once." The psychological effect was significant. German pilots in late 1944 and early 1945 were already suffering from poor morale due to fuel shortages, overwhelming Allied numbers, and the obvious trajectory of the war. Encountering opponents who seemed impossible to engage successfully, who could attack with impunity and escape without risk, further eroded combat effectiveness. When survival depends on aggressive pursuit of enemy fighters, but pursuit consistently fails, pilots become hesitant. They second-guess attack opportunities. They disengage earlier. Combat effectiveness collapses. A Luftwaffe tactical analysis document dated April 2, 1945, attempted to provide guidance for countering American energy tactics. When engaged by P-51 employing vertical attack patterns, pilots should immediately descend to low altitude where the Mustang's supercharger advantage is minimized. Do not attempt to climb with the P-51. Do not follow the P-51 if it extends away at high speed. Remain at low altitude and maximum speed. Force the engagement into horizontal maneuvers where BF-109 retains advantage. This guidance was theoretically sound, but practically difficult to execute when the engagement started at 25,000 feet and the German pilot was already defensive. The Korean War validated Harrison's methods on a larger scale. When American F-86 Sabre pilots faced Soviet-trained MiG-15 opponents over the Yalu River, they found themselves in a similar situation to Harrison's. The MiG-15 could outturn the F-86, could climb faster, and had better performance at high altitude. On paper, the MiG should have dominated. In practice, American pilots trained in energy tactics achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1. The F-86 pilots used the same basic method: maintain speed, avoid sustained turning, use diving attacks from altitude, and extend away to reset the engagement. They called it boom and zoom, the same phrase that had emerged from World War II Mustang operations. The physics hadn't changed. Aircraft with good acceleration and dive performance could control engagements regardless of turning ability. Major John Boyd, the legendary fighter pilot and military theorist, studied Harrison's combat records while developing his energy maneuverability theory in the 1960s. Boyd's work revolutionized fighter design and tactics by quantifying what pilots like Harrison had understood intuitively: that air combat was about energy state management, not arbitrary measures of agility. Boyd's EM diagrams showed mathematically what Harrison demonstrated practically: that an aircraft with superior specific excess power could dominate opponents who relied on instantaneous turn rate. The F-15 Eagle, designed in the 1970s according to Boyd's principles, embodied Harrison's tactical philosophy and its engineering requirements. The F-15's design prioritized thrust-to-weight ratio and acceleration over pure turning performance. Its radar and weapon systems allowed engagement from beyond visual range, eliminating turning fights entirely when possible. The result was an aircraft with a combat record of 104 kills and 0 losses, the ultimate expression of energy fighting doctrine. Modern fighter tactics still teach energy management as the foundation of air combat. Student pilots at the U.S. Air Force's Fighter Weapons School learn to evaluate every maneuver based on its energy cost, to avoid situations where their energy state is disadvantageous, and to exploit superior energy states with vertical tactics. These lessons trace directly to World War II, to pilots like Harrison, who figured out that staying fast and staying high meant staying alive. Harrison's success came at 0 personal physical cost, but significant psychological weight. He witnessed friends die in combat, saw aircraft explode, heard radio calls for help that he couldn't answer because he was miles away maintaining his altitude. His methods were effective, but required discipline that bordered on ruthlessness. The discipline to climb away while a wingman fought below, trusting that maintaining position would allow a better rescue attempt than abandoning tactical advantage in a futile direct intervention. In a 1989 interview, 50 years after the war, Harrison reflected on his experiences. "People called my tactics cowardly. They said I ran away from fights. What they didn't understand is that every fight I ran from, I came back to on my terms. The pilots who called me coward were brave men, and many of them died being brave. I wasn't trying to be brave. I was trying to be effective. There's a difference." He acknowledged the moral complexity of his approach. When you're in a formation and enemy fighters attack, there's tremendous pressure to stay with your buddies, to turn and fight right there. Climbing away feels like abandonment, but if I turned and fought, I'd be just another P-51 in a turning fight, probably getting shot up, definitely not helping the situation. By climbing, I could come back in 60 seconds with every advantage, and that's when I could actually help. But those 60 seconds were the longest of my life, every time. The German pilots. Harrison shot down were mostly young men in their late teens or early 20s, defending their homeland against what they saw as indiscriminate bombing of German cities. Many were poorly trained, thrown into combat with minimal flight hours because German training infrastructure had collapsed under Allied bombing. Harrison's method was particularly devastating against inexperienced pilots who would commit to pursuit attacks without understanding the energy trap they were entering. "I killed 18 men," Harrison said in 1989. "I know that. I tried not to think about them as men during the war. They were targets, threats, enemy aircraft. After the war, I started thinking about them differently. They had families. They had reasons they were flying. The war made us enemies, but the war ending didn't make what I did go away. I did what I had to do to survive and help my side win. I'd do it again, but I wouldn't feel good about it." Harrison never glorified his kills. His logbook entries were clinical. Bf 109 destroyed 25,000 feet 6 miles southwest of Leipzig, 1407 hours. No embellishment, no celebration, just facts. His crew chief remembered that Harrison never painted kill markings on his aircraft, unlike most aces who proudly displayed their scores. When asked why, Harrison said simply, "It's not a score, it's a count." The psychological toll of combat affected Harrison despite his survival. He suffered recurring nightmares for years after the war, dreams of being unable to climb, of his engine failing at altitude, of falling slow through the sky while enemy fighters closed in. These weren't flashbacks to actual events. Harrison never experienced these situations in reality. They were manifestations of the constant vigilance required to maintain his tactical discipline, the awareness that a single mistake or mechanical failure would render his methods useless and leave him as vulnerable as any other pilot. Harrison remained in the Army Air Forces after VE Day, transitioning to the newly formed U.S. Air Force in 1947. He served as a tactics instructor at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, where he taught energy fighting principles to a new generation of fighter pilots. His students included several who would become aces in Korea using the methods he pioneered. He was offered promotion to lieutenant colonel and a staff position at Air Force headquarters in 1950, but declined, choosing instead to retire from active duty. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "I've spent 6 years teaching people how to kill more efficiently. I'm good at it. Maybe too good at it. I'd like to spend the rest of my life doing something else." Harrison returned to Illinois, though not to farming. He used his GI Bill benefits to earn a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Illinois, graduating in 1954 at age 32. He went to work for Caterpillar, the heavy equipment manufacturer, where he spent 28 years as an engineer designing hydraulic systems for bulldozers and excavators. Co-workers knew he'd been a fighter pilot, but few knew his combat record. He didn't talk about it unless asked directly, and even then, his answers were brief. He married in 1956 to Margaret Holbrook, a librarian from Peoria. They had 3 children. Harrison was, by all accounts, a quiet father and husband, methodical and patient, teaching his children the same mechanical skills his own father had taught him. He built a workshop in his garage where he restored vintage tractors as a hobby, finding peace in the predictable logic of mechanical restoration. The Air Force invited him to speak at the Air Force Academy in 1967, asking him to address cadets about his combat experiences. Harrison's speech, preserved in Academy archives, lasted 20 minutes. He spent 15 minutes discussing energy management, flight performance calculations, and tactical decision-making. He spent 3 minutes on the emotional realities of combat. He concluded with this statement: "Being a fighter pilot is 10% skill, 10% courage, and 80% calculation. The pilots who survive are the ones who never stop calculating, who think 3 moves ahead, who understand that combat is a math problem where the wrong answer means you die. If that sounds cold, it's because it has to be. You can't outbrave physics." The effectiveness of Harrison's tactics can be quantified precisely using energy maneuverability analysis. A P-51 Mustang at 25,000 feet traveling at 350 miles per hour has a specific energy level of approximately 43,000 feet. A Bf 109G at the same altitude and speed has identical specific energy. In a turning fight, both aircraft bleed energy at roughly similar rates, the Bf 109G slightly faster due to higher wing loading, but not enough to create decisive advantage. But when Harrison's P-51 climbs at 165 miles per hour, indicated airspeed, while the Bf-109 pursues, the energy dynamics shift dramatically. The P-51 at 165 IAS is operating near its optimal climb speed, achieving approximately 2,800 feet per minute rate of climb at 25,000 feet. The Bf-109G, attempting to maintain pursuit at 165 IAS, is operating below its optimal climb speed and can achieve only approximately 2,100 feet per minute at that altitude. After 90 seconds of climbing, the P-51 has gained 4,200 feet of altitude, while the Bf-109G has gained 3,150 feet, a separation of 1,050 feet despite starting at the same altitude. More critically, both aircraft have bled airspeed. The P-51, designed for high-altitude operations with its two-stage supercharger, maintains better thrust at 29,000-plus feet. The Bf-109G's engine begins to starve. At this point, Harrison would reverse, pushing into a dive while the Bf-109 is slow and high. A diving P-51 accelerates at approximately 15 miles per hour per second in the first few seconds of a dive. Within 10 seconds, Harrison's aircraft would be traveling at 450-plus miles per hour, while the Bf-109, trying to reverse its own climb, would be maneuvering at perhaps 200 miles per hour. The speed differential is 250 miles per hour, more than enough for Harrison to position for a deflection shot or a direct stern attack. If the first pass misses, Harrison's excess speed carries him through and below the engagement, where he can zoom climb back to altitude using his kinetic energy. The Bf-109, now at 29,000 feet with low airspeed, cannot pursue downward without risking a stall, cannot pursue upward because Harrison is faster, and cannot stay where it is because Harrison will simply climb back and repeat the attack. This mathematical trap is inescapable, except through perfect gunnery by the German pilot during the brief moment of Harrison's initial diving pass, a deflection shot against a target moving at 450-plus miles per hour, requiring the German pilot to lead by dozens of feet while his own aircraft shudders on the edge of a stall. The probability of success is less than 5%, even for experienced pilots. Harrison's 18 kills represent 18 German pilots who entered this trap and couldn't escape. His zero combat damage represents 78 missions where German pilots either recognized the trap and refused to enter it, or entered it and couldn't execute the near-impossible gunnery required to damage Harrison during his high-speed passes. Harrison's tactics worked only because the P-51 Mustang possessed specific technological characteristics that most World War II fighters lacked. The key was the Packard 5.1650 Merlin engine with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. This system compressed intake air in 2 stages, allowing the engine to maintain sea-level pressure ratios up to 30,000 feet. Most German fighters used single-stage superchargers that couldn't compensate for thin air above 20,000 feet. The engineering was sophisticated. The Merlin's first supercharger stage compressed air from ambient pressure to an intermediate pressure. An intercooler then cooled this compressed air before the second stage compressed it further. The intercooler was critical. Compressing air heats it, and hot air is less dense. By cooling between stages, the system could pack more oxygen into the cylinders, maintaining combustion efficiency at altitude. German engineers understood this principle. They simply couldn't manufacture two-stage superchargers in sufficient quantities. Germany's industrial capacity, stretched by fighting on multiple fronts and subjected to strategic bombing, couldn't produce complex engine accessories in the numbers required. The Bf-109G's DB605 engine used a simpler single-stage supercharger that was easier to build but limited high-altitude performance. This technological edge meant Harrison's P-51 could make 1,490 horsepower at 25,000 feet, while a Bf-109G made perhaps 1,100 horsepower at the same altitude. That 390 horsepower difference translated directly into superior climb rate, acceleration, and energy fighting capability. Harrison understood his aircraft's strengths at a mechanical level because of his farming background. He'd grown up understanding that engines had performance curves, that operating equipment at its optimal point meant maximum efficiency. The P-51's aerodynamics complemented the engine's power. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag, allowing higher speeds at the same power setting. The bubble canopy provided excellent visibility, letting Harrison spot threats earlier. The aircraft's range, enabled by internal wing fuel tanks and external drop tanks, meant Harrison could patrol bomber formations for hours rather than minutes, giving him more opportunities to engage on favorable terms. Harrison flew his last combat mission on May 7, 1945, the day before VE Day. The mission was a sweep over Czechoslovakia looking for any remaining Luftwaffe fighters. His squadron encountered no enemy aircraft. The flight lasted 3 hours and 17 minutes. Harrison's logbook entry read, "Fighter sweep Prague area, no contact, good visibility, war ends tomorrow." After landing at Leiston, Harrison supervised the post-flight inspection of his aircraft as usual. His crew chief, Technical Sergeant O'Brien, asked if he felt anything special knowing it was his last mission. Harrison's reply, recorded in O'Brien's memoir published in 1991, was characteristic. "I feel relieved, I'm grateful, and I'm tired. Mostly tired." Harrison had flown 112 total combat missions, 78 with the 357 Fighter Group from March to November 1944, and 34 more after taking command of the 363 Fighter Squadron from November 1944 to May 1945. His total combat flight time was 387 hours. He'd fired his guns in anger on 48 separate occasions. His ammunition expenditure totaled 8,640 rounds. His confirmed kills were 18. His aircraft had sustained 0 combat damage. The statistical improbability of this record is staggering. The 357th Fighter Group lost 128 aircraft to combat and operational causes during the war. The group flew 15,483 sorties. That's a loss rate of 0.826% per sortie. If Harrison's 112 missions subjected him to average risk, his probability of completing them all without losses would be approximately 39%, less than coin flip odds. But Harrison didn't accept average risk. His tactics reduced his exposure to the point where the probability calculations failed because they assumed engagement on equal terms. His squadron's loss rate under his command, 0.69% compared to the group's 1.87%, suggests his methods reduced pilot mortality by approximately 63%. If every squadron in the 8th Air Force had adopted Harrison's tactics and achieved similar results, the Air Force might have saved over 300 pilots' lives in the final 6 months of the European War. The cost would have been a reduction in aggressive pursuit of enemy fighters, potentially allowing more German fighters to escape. But given that Allied air superiority was already overwhelming by late 1944, this trade would have been favorable. They called him cautious when he was a student pilot. They said he lacked aggression when he washed out of bomber training. They called him Grandma Harrison when he refused to practice low-altitude aerobatics. They said he was running away when he climbed instead of turning. They called his tactics cowardly when other pilots threw their aircraft into desperate turning fights and came home shot full of holes or didn't come home at all. Then the numbers spoke louder than opinions. 18 confirmed kills, 8,640 rounds fired, 0 combat damage in 47 missions, 112 missions completed, 0 friendly aircraft lost under his command in squadron operations. Then the Luftwaffe spoke louder than critics. Ignore and disengage. That's what their tactical report said. The German Air Force, fighting for survival over its own homeland, told its pilots to avoid one American pilot because engaging him was pointless. Then, physics spoke loudest of all. Energy states, climb rates, thrust-to-weight ratios, specific excess power. These aren't opinions or attitudes. They're mathematical realities that determine who lives and who dies when aircraft meet at altitude. Harrison understood these realities because he'd grown up understanding machines, understanding that every mechanical system has a nature, a way it wants to be operated, and fighting that nature is how you break things or how you get broken. He was a farm boy from Illinois who learned to fix tractors before he learned to fly airplanes. He washed out of bomber training because he cared more about aircraft performance than crew coordination. He barely passed fighter training because instructors valued aggression over calculation. He was placed in a combat unit almost by accident, assigned to fill losses rather than selected for excellence. And then he changed how fighter pilots think about combat. The P-51 Mustang was designed to be a long-range escort fighter, a bomber protector, an aircraft that could fly to Berlin and back. Harrison understood that those design requirements, range, high-altitude performance, speed, also made it an unprecedented energy-fighting platform. He understood that turning with the enemy played to German strengths while abandoning American advantages. He understood that staying fast meant staying alive, that altitude was currency, that patience was a weapon. 78 years after Harrison's final mission, Air Force pilots still learn energy fighting tactics as the foundation of aerial combat. The specific aircraft have changed, F-35s instead of P-51s, radar-guided missiles instead of .50 caliber guns, but the underlying principles remain identical. Maintain energy state. Fight on your terms, use your strengths, avoid your weaknesses, calculate 3 moves ahead. Captain Charles Harrison died in 2011 at age 89 in Peoria, Illinois. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned he'd been a World War II fighter ace and a mechanical engineer for Caterpillar. It listed his survivors, his wife Margaret, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. It noted he enjoyed restoring vintage tractors. It was a quiet ending for a man who'd lived a quiet life after an extraordinary war. But in fighter squadrons around the world, instructors still teach the tactics he pioneered. They don't always know his name. Tactics become doctrine, doctrine becomes tradition, and tradition forgets its origins. But the method persists. When a young pilot asks why they should climb instead of turn, why they should extend instead of engage, why they should calculate instead of commit, the instructor's answer echoes lessons learned in the skies over Germany in 1944. Because the pilot who's fast and high chooses when to fight. The pilot who's slow and low hopes the enemy makes a mistake. Which one do you want to be? Harrison chose to be fast and high. 18 German pilots who chose to pursue him died in that choice. Hundreds of German pilots who recognized the trap disengaged and lived to fight another day, but accomplished nothing while Harrison's bombers continued toward their targets. 34 American pilots in Harrison's squadron survived missions that might have killed them because their commander taught them to value calculation over courage. The stupid dogfight style that instructors criticized became the smart survival strategy that saved lives. The farm boy who barely passed training became the tactician who rewrote doctrine. The pilot who wouldn't turn when others turned, became untouchable by refusing to fight on any terms but his own. In the end, maybe that's the lesson. Sometimes the smartest way to fight is to refuse to fight the way everyone expects. Sometimes survival requires understanding your tools better than your training. Sometimes breaking the rules isn't about rebellion, it's about physics. Charles Harrison understood his machine. He understood his enemy. He understood himself. And he understood that when those 3 things align properly, speed and altitude matter more than aggression and courage. The Luftwaffe called him untouchable. His instructors called him cowardly. History called him effective. He called himself a mechanic who learned to fly. He was all of these things, and he came home alive, which was the only score that really mattered. Harrison never glorified his kills. His logbook entries were clinical. Bf-109 destroyed 25,000 feet 6 miles southwest of Leipzig, 1407 hours. No embellishment, no celebration, just facts. His crew chief remembered that Harrison never painted kill markings on his aircraft, unlike most aces who proudly displayed their scores. When asked why, Harrison said simply, "It's not a score, it's a count." The psychological toll of combat affected Harrison despite his survival. He suffered recurring nightmares for years after the war, dreams of being unable to climb, of his engine failing at altitude, of falling slow through the sky while enemy fighters closed in. These weren't flashbacks to actual events. Harrison never experienced these situations in reality. They were manifestations of the constant vigilance required to maintain his tactical discipline, the awareness that a single mistake or mechanical failure would render his methods useless and leave him as vulnerable as any other pilot. Harrison remained in the Army Air Forces after VE Day, transitioning to the newly formed U.S. Air Force in 1947. He served as a tactics instructor at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, where he taught energy fighting principles to a new generation of fighter pilots. His students included several who would become aces in Korea using the methods he pioneered. He was offered promotion to lieutenant colonel and a staff position at Air Force headquarters in 1950, but declined, choosing instead to retire from active duty. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "I've spent 6 years teaching people how to kill more efficiently. I'm good at it. Maybe too good at it. I'd like to spend the rest of my life doing something else." Harrison returned to Illinois, though not to farming. He used his GI Bill benefits to earn a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Illinois, graduating in 1954 at age 32. He went to work for Caterpillar, the heavy equipment manufacturer, where he spent 28 years as an engineer designing hydraulic systems for bulldozers and excavators. Co-workers knew he'd been a fighter pilot, but few knew his combat record. He didn't talk about it unless asked directly, and even then, his answers were brief. He married in 1956 to Margaret Holbrook, a librarian from Peoria. They had 3 children. Harrison was, by all accounts, a quiet father and husband, methodical and patient, teaching his children the same mechanical skills his own father had taught him. He built a workshop in his garage where he restored vintage tractors as a hobby, finding peace in the predictable logic of mechanical restoration. The Air Force invited him to speak at the Air Force Academy in 1967, asking him to address cadets about his combat experiences. Harrison's speech, preserved in Academy archives, lasted 20 minutes. He spent 15 minutes discussing energy management, flight performance calculations, and tactical decision-making. He spent 3 minutes on the emotional realities of combat. He concluded with this statement: "Being a fighter pilot is 10% skill, 10% courage, and 80% calculation. The pilots who survive are the ones who never stop calculating, who think 3 moves ahead, who understand that combat is a math problem where the wrong answer means you die. If that sounds cold, it's because it has to be. You can't outbrave physics." The effectiveness of Harrison's tactics can be quantified precisely using energy maneuverability analysis. A P-51 Mustang at 25,000 feet traveling at 350 miles per hour has a specific energy level of approximately 43,000 feet. A Bf-109G at the same altitude and speed has identical specific energy. In a turning fight, both aircraft bleed energy at roughly similar rates, the Bf-109G slightly faster due to higher wing loading, but not enough to create decisive advantage. But when Harrison's P-51 climbs at 165 miles per hour, indicated airspeed, while the Bf-109 pursues, the energy dynamics shift dramatically. The P-51 at 165 IAS is operating near its optimal climb speed, achieving approximately 2,800 feet per minute rate of climb at 25,000 feet. The Bf-109G, attempting to maintain pursuit at 165 IAS, is operating below its optimal climb speed and can achieve only approximately 2,100 feet per minute at that altitude. After 90 seconds of climbing, the P-51 has gained 4,200 feet of altitude, while the Bf-109G has gained 3,150 feet, a separation of 1,050 feet despite starting at the same altitude. More critically, both aircraft have bled airspeed. The P-51, designed for high-altitude operations with its 2-stage supercharger, maintains better thrust at 29,000-plus feet. The Bf-109G's engine begins to starve.